hate. In the NBA, it's not just emotion, it's fuel. In the 1990s, when elbows flew, trash talk cut deep, and the paint was a war zone, few players embodied toughness like Dikembe Mutombo, a four-time Defensive Player of the Year, one of the most feared rim protectors in history, and the owner of the most iconic finger wag the league has ever seen. But behind every block, every scowl, and every playoff battle, there were players who got under his skin, guys who tested his patience, who pushed him physically and mentally, who turned every game into something personal. Mutombo wasn't the type to start a fight, but he never forgot one. He took every cheap shot, every post-up, every stare down personally. And when he talks about the players he hated playing against, you know it's real. These weren't friendly rivalries, these were battles. These are the 6 players Dikembe Mutombo hated the most. But before proceeding, please take a second and subscribe and like this video. It will be very motivation for us. When Dikembe Mutombo talks about players who truly got under his skin, Dennis Rodman sits right at the top of that list. It wasn't just about talent, it was about chaos. Rodman wasn't built to play a clean, predictable game. He was built to disrupt everything. By the time their paths crossed in the 1990s, Rodman had already cemented his reputation as one of the most relentless defenders and rebounders the game had ever seen. He didn't care if you were a star center, a scoring guard, or an MVP candidate. His job was to make you uncomfortable. And against Mutombo, he did exactly that. Rodman was listed at 6'7", giving up size to most big men he faced. But it never mattered. He fought for every inch. He clawed for rebounds like his life depended on it. He dove into legs, boxed out like a linebacker, and lived in opponents' heads rent-free. For a 7'2" defensive anchor like Mutombo, who built his game on discipline, structure, and rim protection, Rodman was the perfect storm, smaller, faster, unpredictable, and constantly pushing limits. One thing that defined their matchups was physicality. Whenever the Chicago Bulls faced the Atlanta Hawks, or earlier when Rodman was with the Detroit Pistons, you could feel the tension immediately. Rodman would front Mutombo in the post, body him on rebounds, and swipe at the ball long before a shot ever went up. He was never afraid to tug a jersey, throw a forearm, or bait you into a foul. But what really made Rodman a nightmare wasn't just the way he played physically, it was how he talked. He chirped constantly, finding ways to needle opponents, break their focus, and drag them into his world. Mutombo, who prided himself on composure, often found himself dealing with Rodman's trash talk before even getting a touch on offense. And the more Mutombo got frustrated, the more Rodman leaned in. Their battles on the glass were brutal. Rodman led the league in rebounding for 7 straight seasons, and a big part of that was how well he studied opponents. He wasn't just fighting for position blindly. He anticipated angles, understood trajectories, and slipped under bigger men at the perfect moment. Mutombo was one of the few players strong enough to keep him honest, but even he admitted that Rodman's relentlessness wore you down over the course of a game. And then there was the mind game. Rodman didn't need to score to win matchups. He could have 0 points and still completely dictate the flow of a game by pulling star big men out of rhythm. For a rim protector like Mutombo, who needed to control the paint to control the game, Rodman was a disruptor unlike any other. It wasn't a one-sided rivalry, though. Mutombo blocked plenty of Rodman's shots and gave him just as much physical resistance, but Rodman thrived in the mud. He wanted you to push back. He wanted the game to get ugly, and that was where he had the edge. One memorable clash came in the late 1990s when the Hawks faced the Bulls during Chicago's second three-peat run. Mutombo was playing elite defense, controlling the paint, but Rodman still pulled down double-digit rebounds, poking, tugging, and drawing Mutombo's attention away from the rim. It wasn't flashy, but it was effective. That's how Rodman won battles, not by overpowering stars, but by forcing them into a war of attrition. There was also a clash of personalities. Mutombo had a larger-than-life presence, the finger wag, the roar, the iconic defensive stance. Rodman was the league's great disruptor, piercings, hair dye, wild antics, and elite defense. They represented opposite ends of the emotional spectrum. Mutombo, controlled fury; Rodman, uncontained chaos. When they collided, games got messy fast. In interviews later, Mutombo admitted that playing against Rodman was exhausting, not because of highlight plays, but because every second was a fight. "You never get a break," he once said of players like Rodman. "He just keeps coming." Rodman wasn't a scorer. He didn't block shots like Mutombo, but he was one of the few players who could dictate the tempo of a game against someone that dominant defensively, and that's what made their battles so intense. Rodman brought out Mutombo's competitive fire in a way few others did. For every block and finger wag Mutombo had, Rodman had a shove, a taunt, and a rebound. It wasn't pretty, it wasn't friendly, but it was unforgettable. And that's why Dennis Rodman sits at the very top of Mutombo's most hated list, not out of disrespect, but because every battle with him was a war. Some matchups you prepare for, others you just try to survive. And facing Shaquille O'Neal was survival mode for Dikembe Mutombo. There were plenty of players who irritated him, a few who got under his skin. But Shaq wasn't about irritation. He was about overwhelming force. Every time they met in the paint, it felt like stepping in front of a moving wall. Shaq didn't wear you down with tricks or finesse. He crushed you with pure size, strength, and rhythm-breaking pressure. By the late 1990s and early 2000s, Shaq had become the most physically dominant player of his generation, maybe of any generation. At 7'1" and over 300 pounds, he wasn't just tall. He was explosive, powerful, and surprisingly quick. He didn't post you up to play chess. He posted you up to end the possession. And when he decided to get to the rim, there was very little anyone could do to stop him. For years, Mutombo had made a living by intimidating scorers. Most guys tried to go around him. Shaq went right through him. Their rivalry simmered for seasons, but it hit its peak in the 2001 NBA Finals. Shaq's Los Angeles Lakers were at the height of their powers. He and Kobe Bryant had just swept the Western Conference, and no one had come close to stopping them. Meanwhile, Mutombo's Philadelphia 76ers were scrapping their way to the finals behind Allen Iverson's MVP season and Mutombo's 4th Defensive Player of the Year award. If anyone in the league was built to slow Shaq down, it was Dikembe, but Shaq had other plans. Game 1 was a warning shot. Shaq exploded for 44 points, 20 rebounds, and 5 assists, one of the most dominant finals performances ever. Mutombo fought like he always did, pulling down 13 boards and challenging everything. But Shaq treated the paint like his personal real estate. He powered through contact, absorbed double teams, and finished at the rim as if nothing could stop him. Even though Iverson's iconic step-over on Tyronn Lue stole the headlines, everyone in that building knew who had truly controlled the night. And it didn't stop there. Across the 5-game series, Shaq averaged 33.0 points, 15.8 rebounds, and 3.4 blocks, while shooting over 57% from the field. Mutombo countered with 16.8 rebounds per game and relentless rim protection, but it felt like trying to hold back a flood. Shaq was at his apex, too strong to move, too quick to beat to a spot, too skilled to hope he'd make mistakes. Part of what made him so difficult for Mutombo was the lack of any clear weakness. Mutombo had frustrated stars before because most big men leaned on either brute force or finesse, rarely both. Shaq combined both. If Mutombo sagged back, Shaq buried him under the rim. If he played tight, Shaq spun baseline with that shocking agility for a man his size. And if all else failed, Shaq simply lived at the foul line, piling up fouls on opposing bigs who tried to withstand the hits. The psychological weight of those games was just as real as the physical beating. Shaq made his presence known before the ball even touched his hands. He established deep position early, forcing defenders to brace themselves on every possession. Mutombo, who usually dictated defensive terms, found himself reacting instead of controlling. And once Shaq sealed position, it was already too late. That doesn't mean Mutombo didn't land punches of his own. He blocked shots, contested fiercely, and gave Shaq more resistance than most. In fact, Shaq once admitted that Mutombo was one of the few players who stood his ground. But respect doesn't erase frustration. For Mutombo, these were punishing games, the kind where your arms are sore, your legs are heavy, and your mind never gets a break. The swagger made it worse. Shaq didn't need to say much. His dunks, roars, and smirks after finishing plays said everything. He didn't have to trash talk to get in your head. His dominance did it for him. That psychological edge mattered. Shaq wasn't just winning on the scoreboard. He was winning the battle of willpower. Their duels weren't limited to those finals. They'd gone at each other years earlier when Shaq was with the Orlando Magic, and Mutombo was anchoring defenses for the Denver Nuggets and Atlanta Hawks. Even back then, Shaq tested him immediately. Shoulder down, elbows tight, forcing Mutombo to meet him at full strength. Both centers couldn't hold up. Mutombo did, but it came at a cost. The series ended with Shaq lifting Finals MVP and the Lakers securing their 2nd straight title. Mutombo, bruised but proud, walked off knowing he'd faced the most unstoppable interior force of his time. It wasn't about being outworked. It was about facing something that simply couldn't be contained. This wasn't like battling Dennis Rodman, where the fight was psychological and scrappy. Shaq didn't get under your skin. He went through it. He turned every defensive possession into a heavyweight round, and no matter how disciplined you were, eventually the wall cracked. That's why Shaquille O'Neal stands so high on Mutombo's most hated list, not because of bad blood, but because of what it felt like to stand between him and the basket. Shaq didn't frustrate you. He broke you down, one possession at a time, and even a 4-time Defensive Player of the Year couldn't make him flinch. When Shaq was at his peak, the paint belonged to him, and everyone else, even the best, were just trying to survive. There are rivalries built on trash talk and drama, and then there are the ones forged through years of quiet, physical battles in the paint. Dikembe Mutombo's clashes with Patrick Ewing belong to that second kind. No cheap shots, no theatrics. Just two giants colliding under the rim, neither giving an inch. When Mutombo entered the league in 1991, Ewing was already a veteran star. He'd spent the better part of a decade carrying the New York Knicks, putting up numbers, leading deep playoff runs, and establishing himself as one of the most respected two-way centers in basketball. His game wasn't about flash. It was about discipline, strength, and patience. Ewing was the kind of problem defenders couldn't solve with a single game plan. He had layers: a deadly face-up jumper, a crisp turnaround fadeaway, punishing low-post footwork, and soft touch around the rim. If Mutombo dropped back, Ewing burned him from mid-range. If he stepped out to contest, Ewing used his strength to bury him deeper in the paint. He didn't rely on one big punch. He wore you down with a steady barrage over 48 minutes. Their meetings became defining moments of the 90s Eastern Conference basketball. The Knicks, under Pat Riley, played the most physical style in the league. Mutombo's teams, first the Denver Nuggets, later the Atlanta Hawks and Philadelphia 76ers, were built on toughness too. Whenever these two met, finesse disappeared. It was trench work. Ewing's jumper created a unique headache for a rim protector like Mutombo. Most stars attacked him in the restricted area. Ewing forced him out to 15 to 18 feet, away from his comfort zone, where he couldn't dictate the defense the way he usually did. If Mutombo played up, Ewing muscled his way to the block. If he sent help, Ewing found the open man. It was a game of angles, and Ewing mastered it. And then there was the physical contact. Ewing was 7 feet tall with the frame of a heavyweight. He didn't need words to send a message. A hard seal, a pivot, a shoulder bump, a quick release. Over time, those little battles added up. For Mutombo, that meant constant footwork adjustments, fighting to hold ground, and trying to keep Ewing off balance. He wasn't the kind of opponent who knocked you out in one punch. He just didn't stop throwing them. What made him so difficult wasn't raw power or speed. It was his steadiness. Ewing rarely had off nights. If Mutombo forced a miss, he'd simply reset and go again. That methodical, unshakable approach mirrored Mutombo's own defensive mentality, which made their battles pure contests of will. One matchup in the late 90s stood out. Mutombo controlled the first half, contesting everything and cutting off passing lanes. But in the third quarter, Ewing adjusted. He started stepping further out, facing him up, and forcing Mutombo to play on the perimeter. By the end of the game, Ewing had piled on nearly 30 points, and the Knicks took the win. That was Ewing's signature: patience, precision, and no panic. Ewing's resilience was legendary. His knees, ankles, and shoulders were constantly taped up. Yet he suited up almost every night. Mutombo respected that, but respect didn't make the assignment easier. Guarding him meant constant collisions, constant decisions, and no easy possessions. His resume told a big part of the story: 11 All-Star appearances, more than 24,000 points, a 21-point career scoring average, and a reputation as one of the toughest matchups of the decade. But those numbers didn't capture the feeling of trying to guard him. Ewing wasn't chaos like Dennis Rodman. He wasn't a storm like Shaquille O'Neal. He was something slower, heavier, a wall that just kept pushing. Their rivalry wasn't flashy, and that's what made it brutal. There were no headlines, no sideline drama, just hours of grinding in the post. Against Ewing, there was nothing to exploit, no mental weakness to attack. The only option was to endure. For Mutombo, those matchups were a test of everything he stood for defensively: discipline, footwork, toughness, and more often than not, Ewing matched him step for step. That's what burned the most. That's why Patrick Ewing sits on Mutombo's most hated list. Not because of cheap shots or trash talk or some infamous feud, but because he forced Mutombo to bring his absolute best just to survive. No shortcuts, no tricks, just an endless, methodical battle between two big men who refused to give an inch. When the buzzer sounded, they didn't need to exchange words. The bruises told the story. There are opponents who challenge your skill, and then there are opponents who challenge your entire identity as a defender. For Dikembe Mutombo, that was Michael Jordan. Rodman was chaos. Shaq was brute force. Ewing was relentless. But Jordan was inevitable. He attacked you with skill, intelligence, rhythm, and something Mutombo rarely encountered, absolute control. By the time Mutombo entered the league in 1991, Jordan was already a superstar and on the brink of taking over the basketball world completely. He wasn't just the best scorer, he was the measuring stick. You didn't just play against Jordan. You got exposed, tested, and hunted. And for someone like Mutombo, who built his reputation protecting the rim, guarding Jordan was like trying to plug a leak with your bare hands. No matter how hard you worked, it felt like he'd find another way through. What made Jordan different was the way he manipulated defenses. Against most players, Mutombo controlled the terms. He funneled drivers, cut off angles, and dictated what happened at the rim. Against Jordan, those rules didn't apply. He dictated the terms. He could pull up at 17 feet, glide around you with lightning footwork, or attack the paint with surgical timing. When he took it inside, he wasn't afraid of anyone, not even a shot-blocking monster like Mutombo. There's a reason Jordan loved attacking big men. He thrived on turning rim protectors into victims of highlight reels. And Mutombo was no exception. In fact, one of the most famous moments of their rivalry came in the 1997 playoffs. Mutombo, then with the Atlanta Hawks, had teased Jordan earlier in the series about never dunking on him. Jordan, with that familiar grin, gave a simple, "I haven't yet."
Big for it, you haven't got me yet.
Huh?
Mike,
Don't even try it.
you want me to go call Scotty?
You have to call Scotty.
Boy.
What you gonna call Scotty for? I haven't got you recently. Yeah, I agree with
No,
that.
you haven't got me in the 6 years. 1, 2, just go ahead and say it.
Dikembe.
No.
Never.
You said
Game 5 in Chicago, second quarter. Jordan got the ball on the wing, slashed through traffic, and rose up over Mutombo for a one-handed dunk. It wasn't just a score, it was a message. As Jordan jogged back, he gave Mutombo the famous finger wag, Mutombo's own trademark, flipping the script in front of a roaring Chicago crowd. That moment burned into NBA history and into Mutombo's personal highlight reel of grudges. But that dunk was just the exclamation point. Jordan's real dominance came in the way he controlled entire defenses. He forced shot blockers like Mutombo to move on his rhythm. His footwork was so clean, his timing so precise, that by the time Mutombo left his feet, Jordan was already past him. And even when Mutombo timed it perfectly, Jordan could hang in the air just a beat longer, float around the contact, and make the shot. The numbers tell the story clearly. In the 1997 Eastern Conference semifinals, Jordan averaged over 30 points a game on efficient shooting against Atlanta's elite defense. Mutombo anchored that defense, fresh off winning Defensive Player of the Year, and yet even he couldn't slow Jordan down. No scheme worked for long. Traps, doubles, collapses at the rim. Jordan had an answer for everything. It wasn't just the scoring. Jordan's psychological impact on defenders was suffocating. Most players attacked the basket cautiously when Mutombo patrolled the paint. Jordan attacked like he owned it. He never hesitated. That swagger, that control, forced defenders out of their comfort zones before the ball even crossed half court. Mutombo was used to being the wall. Against Jordan, he felt like a door waiting to be kicked in. And Jordan wasn't reckless. That's what made him so brutal. He picked his spots like a surgeon. One quarter, he'd hit jumpers, pulling Mutombo out just a step too far. The next, he'd slash to the rim, knowing exactly when help was late. He'd use the pump fake to freeze defenders, the footwork to slide past, and that explosive first step to erase any defensive plan you thought you had. Mutombo, to his credit, never backed down. He contested every drive, met Jordan in midair, and occasionally got a block. But those moments were rare, and Jordan made sure the world remembered the ones that went his way. He thrived on challenging elite defenders, and Mutombo was the perfect test case. Long, smart, proud, and physical. Exactly the kind of player Jordan loved to beat. Their regular season battles carried the same intensity. Even when Mutombo was with the Denver Nuggets early in his career, Jordan had a habit of attacking him again and again. For Jordan, shot blockers were never deterrents. They were targets. He studied tendencies, picked his angles, and delivered daggers that looked effortless, but were built on meticulous preparation. And Mutombo, a defensive anchor by nature, hated it. Not because Jordan disrespected him, but because no matter how sharp his rotations were or how disciplined his positioning, Jordan could break the structure. He made defenders feel like their best wasn't enough. And that's a unique kind of frustration. Jordan danced around the very idea of control. He didn't fight Mutombo where he was strongest. He went where Mutombo wasn't. That's what made these matchups sting. Some players frustrated Dikembe Mutombo because they were crafty, some because they were unstoppable. But Alonzo Mourning, He frustrated Mutombo because he fought him where Mutombo was most comfortable, inside, in the heart of the paint. Mourning met him straight on. Their clashes in the late 1990s and early 2000s were punishing. Mourning wasn't just another big man. He was a two-time Defensive Player of the Year, a relentless shot blocker, and one of the most intense interior players of his generation. Every possession carried the weight of a personal duel. Mourning's style was perfectly built to make a rim protector miserable. He didn't drift out for jumpers or float around the perimeter. He lived at the rim, explosive, compact, and physically relentless. At 6 feet 10 inches, he didn't have Mutombo's wingspan, but he used his lower center of gravity, leverage, and sheer aggression to win position battles most big men lost. He attacked straight lines, took the hit, and kept coming. Their rivalry truly heated up when Mourning anchored the Miami Heat and Mutombo patrolled the paint for the Atlanta Hawks. Both teams leaned into their identity: half-court pace, physical defense, and interior control. Their meetings didn't feel like track meets. They felt like wrestling matches wrapped inside basketball games. Mourning didn't shy away from contact. He embraced it. He'd lower his shoulder, fight for deep post position, and force Mutombo to battle for leverage on every entry pass. And what made it worse for Mutombo wasn't just the physical pounding. It was the fact that Zo carried the same defensive pride. He wanted to own the paint just as badly as Mutombo did. Very few players mirrored Mutombo's intensity on defense. Mourning was one of the exceptions, and that meant these matchups weren't just about scoring or shot blocking. They were about dominance, about who controlled the lane. On top of the collisions, Zo could score. He wasn't Shaq, but he was efficient. He had a solid jump hook, a face-up jumper from the elbows, and enough mid-range touch to keep defenses honest. Mutombo couldn't simply sit under the rim and wait. He had to step up and move his feet every possession. That extra step wore on a defender over the course of 48 minutes. Statistically, Mourning's prime was a problem for everyone. In 1999 to 2000, he averaged 21.7 points, 9.5 rebounds, and 3.7 blocks a game while winning his second Defensive Player of the Year award. Mutombo, still one of the league's premier rim protectors, saw in Zo a rare opponent who matched his physical edge, not just in one game, but year after year. And then there was the emotion. Mourning didn't celebrate quietly. When he got a big block or a tough bucket, he let the building know. He flexed. He roared. He fed the crowd. It wasn't personal disrespect. But for Mutombo, who viewed the paint like his own territory, those moments cut deep. Most players came into games against Mutombo thinking about how to avoid him. Mourning did the opposite. He went right at him, not just to score, but to challenge the entire defensive foundation Mutombo stood on. Their playoff battles were especially intense. Miami and Atlanta both depended on their centers to set the tone. When Zo and Mutombo were on the floor together, the lane felt small, possessions were slow, grinding, and physical. The referees often let them play, which meant a lot of bruises and little breathing room. But what wore Mutombo down most wasn't a single highlight or one unforgettable moment. It was the cumulative effect. Mourning never let up. He fought for position on plays that didn't even involve him. He set hard screens. He banged for rebounds. He contested every shot. By the fourth quarter, those little moments added up to a war of attrition. The respect between them was real. Both men were among the best defenders of their era, but respect didn't make it less frustrating. Mutombo hated playing against players who could take away his advantage, and that's exactly what Mourning did. He didn't overpower him like Shaq. He didn't glide past him like Jordan. He met him in the middle and forced Mutombo to beat a version of himself. The mental battle mattered as much as the physical one. When Zo blocked a shot, he celebrated like he'd just won a round. When Mutombo answered with a swat of his own, Zo came right back the next trip down. Neither man backed off, neither showed fatigue, neither accepted second place in the paint. Unlike some of Mutombo's other rivalries, there's no single clip that defines this one. No iconic dunk, no headline quote. Instead, it's remembered for what it felt like: exhausting, bruising, and deeply personal. Every game between them left both men with sore ribs, scuffed arms, and ice bags on their knees. And that's why Alonzo Mourning sits on Mutombo's most hated list. He wasn't an irritant like Dennis Rodman. He wasn't an unstoppable force like Shaquille O'Neal. He was a mirror, someone who reflected Mutombo's own identity back at him, possession after possession. That's the kind of matchup defenders never forget. Not because they were humiliated, but because they had to give everything just to survive. And with Zo, survival was never guaranteed. Not every rivalry in Dikembe Mutombo's career was born out of trash talk or heated grudges. Some were forged in a quieter, more painful way, by facing someone so technically sound, so methodical, that you couldn't bend the game to your will. That was what it felt like to face David Robinson. If Shaquille O'Neal was a storm and Alonzo Mourning was a mirror, then Robinson was precision. No theatrics, no chaos, just clean, clinical basketball that stripped defenders of their usual advantages. At 7 feet 1 inch with elite athleticism, Robinson was the rare big man who could explode past slower defenders or calmly rise over them. But what made him a nightmare for Mutombo wasn't just physical talent, it was how efficiently he used it. Robinson's game was all economy of motion, smooth footwork, quick reads, flawless mid-range touch. He forced defenders to react to him. Most centers eventually ended up playing on Mutombo's terms. Robinson never did. He controlled space like a chess master controlling the board. Give him an inch, he'd hit the elbow jumper, crowd him, and he'd blow past with that quick first step and glide to the rim. And even when Mutombo rotated perfectly, Robinson had the balance and touch to finish anyway. The rivalry took shape in the early 1990s when Robinson was already an MVP-caliber star with the San Antonio Spurs and Mutombo was emerging as an elite defender with the Denver Nuggets. It was skill meeting structure, an unstoppable scorer versus one of the best rim protectors of the era. Robinson averaged nearly 30 points in 1993 to 94. Mutombo led the league in blocks that same season. Their matchups were battles between two apex specialists. Robinson's face-up game was especially cruel to big men. Unlike bruisers who tried to back their way in, he could face you, jab, pivot, and make you guess. A half step wrong was enough for him to create separation. Mutombo, who excelled at controlling angles and funneling drives, found himself constantly having to chase Robinson's rhythm, something very few players ever forced him to do. What made it even more frustrating was Robinson's demeanor. He didn't talk, he didn't celebrate, he just executed. No flex, no roar, no finger wag, just basket after basket, delivered with calm precision. For a competitor like Mutombo, who thrived on imposing his will and rattling opponents, that kind of quiet dominance was maddening. And then there was defense. Robinson wasn't just a scorer, he was a two-way machine. Quick, long, and disciplined, he could front the post, slide his feet, and contest without fouling. Against most centers, Mutombo could carve out deep position and work his angles. Against Robinson, that space vanished. Even when Mutombo won the initial battle, Robinson's recovery speed erased any advantage. One game in 1995 captured their dynamic perfectly. Robinson erupted for over 40 points, slicing through Denver's defense with a mix of jumpers, spins, and hooks. Mutombo got his blocks. He always did, but Robinson just adapted, adjusting the next possession like he was solving an equation. That was the Robinson experience. Nothing flashy, nothing desperate, just clinical solutions to every defensive problem. And that, more than anything, separated him from other rivals. Robinson simply operated above the noise. He didn't need to outmuscle you or get in your head. He outplayed you with calm, surgical precision. His resume backed up the feeling. MVP in 1995, scoring champion in 1994, 10-time All-Star, 2-time Defensive Player of the Year, Olympic gold medalist. He wasn't just a great scorer or a great defender, he was both, wrapped into one of the most complete big men of his era. Mutombo prided himself on taking something away from every opponent. Robinson didn't leave anything to take. His conditioning was another edge. Robinson could run the floor like a wing. Transition plays that forced most centers to lumber back were just another scoring opportunity for him. Mutombo couldn't rest. He had to sprint, rotate, and recover constantly. That constant physical and mental strain was part of why these matchups were so exhausting. And unlike some of the more physical big men of the 1990s, Robinson never let the game turn into a wrestling match under the rim. He stayed clean, methodical, and deliberate. Mutombo, who excelled when games got messy, couldn't drag Robinson into that kind of battle. That lack of control, that feeling of always playing on someone else's terms, was something he hated more than trash talk or physical punishment. Mutombo respected Robinson as much as any opponent he ever faced, but respect doesn't soften the frustration. Facing Robinson was like taking an exam you'd studied for all night, and still realizing you were a step behind on every question. It was just too complete. Their matchup stretched through much of the decade, with Robinson's San Antonio Spurs often in contention and Mutombo's teams fighting to pull off upsets. But whether it was the regular season or the playoffs, the pattern rarely changed. Mutombo brought everything. Robinson calmly dismantled it, and that's why David Robinson lands on Mutombo's most hated list. Not because of humiliation or bad blood, but because he was the opponent who stripped away Mutombo's greatest strength, control. Rodman brought chaos, Shaq brought force, Jordan brought inevitability, Mourning brought pride, Ewing brought grind, Robinson brought precision. And when precision is that clean, even the best defenders are forced to play catch-up. And that's what made David Robinson such a brutal opponent for Dikembe Mutombo. Not the noise, not the flash, but the precision. Every player on this list got under Mutombo's skin in a different way, but Robinson's methodical dominance left a unique kind of frustration, the quiet kind that lingers. But if you want to see that same rivalry energy from the other side, not the players Mutombo hated, but the ones greats actually admired, you'll love this. Head over to my next video, Shaq names his 6 favorite players, where we break down the legends who earned the Diesel's respect. Please do not forget to subscribe to the channel and share the video and comment down your thoughts.